This content analysis assignment is about the timeline of events that impacted and laid the foundation for ESL programs and what types of programs have been implemented over the years. Here's an overview of the different programs and acts and different civil cases that I'm going to be talking about today. The first one happened in 1954, and the most recent one I'm going to be talking about is one from 2015. The first one is Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. This was a case that went to the Supreme Court, and it outlawed segregated schools as inconsistent with equal education. It made it clear that English language learners cannot be segregated completely from the English classroom because they are not getting the same education. You see, these schools were pulling kids out from the regular classroom under the pretense that they were helping them learn English. Brown versus Board of Education made that illegal. It made it clear that states must provide students with equal education opportunities, and this was not just a federal law, but it's also at the state level. Next, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it banned the discrimination against race, sex, and national origin in public facilities. You see, schools are public facilities, therefore schools could no longer discriminate based on race. This act opened the doors for further English language learning policies, and it was the basis for future change. Next, we have one from 1965, which is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This act targeted low-income families and addressed the academic needs of poor children. It helped improve the schooling of English learners, just like the Civil Rights Act did. You see, unfortunately, the lower socioeconomic children many times are the English language learners. Therefore, that is why in the long run, this act helped English language learners. Next, we have the Tucson Conference from 1966. This conference led to a report that was published about innovative schools that made use of the students' home languages to teach content in southwestern states. The report recommended to take away English-only instruction laws and stated that instruction throughout early grades should be taught with English as a second language. This then led to the Bilingual Education Act of 1968. Lyndon B. Johnson is the president who signed the Bilingual Education Act of 1968 into law. This was the first act passed that was directly devoted to students with limited English skills. It provided grants to school districts so they would have money to help English language learners. This act stated with just Spanish-speaking children is how it started, but ultimately it merged with other bills to include all children of limited English-speaking ability. This meant that they came from environments where their main language was something other than English. The original version of this act was vague about solutions, and it did not include the definition of bilingual education. This caused great confusion on the purpose and goal of this act and how students would benefit from the instruction in their home language. The next thing I will be talking about is Lau versus Nichols, which is from 1974, and it is actually a court case. This is seen as one of the most important rulings for bilingual education. The San Francisco schools were accused of neglecting students of Chinese background. This case was actually filed in 1970, but it did not go to court until 1974. Apparently, the attitude for the schools during this time was one of sink or swim. The Chinese American students were mainstreamed into the classroom and they had no English ability, and they were just expected to figure it out. The Supreme Court Justice William Douglas argued with schools, saying equal treatment is not just providing the same classroom, teachers, and curriculum, because students who do not understand English will not get the same education because they will not understand the content that is being presented. This case led to the Lau remedies, which required districts to implement bilingual education programs for English language learners. Next, we have the Equal Opportunities Act from 1974. And the Lau remedies, as previously stated in Lau versus Nichols, actually led to this Equal Opportunities Act. You see, the Lau remedies led to this act, and this act is what put those remedies into law. The act did not mandate bilingual education. However, it did state that schools must take appropriate action to overcome language barriers that would cause English language learners to not have equal participation in core educational subjects. If a student cannot speak English, then the school must provide them with a bilingual education to participate without a language barrier. This is so they are able to learn the content. Next, we have the reauthorization of 1994, and is the reauthorization of Title VII. This is the 5th reauthorization of Bilingual Education Act, and by this time the goals of the Title VII had been clarified. There was a definition for bilingual education and its target population, and the programs to serve this population were made clear. The focus on helping English language learners to achieve fluency in English remained constant. There is now a greater recognition of the personal and social benefits of bilingual education. Title VII funding was improved, and the majority of the funds provided some home language instruction along with English instruction. Next, we have the No Child Left Behind Act from 2002. This law came into effect under George W. Bush, and it changed federal policy for English language learners. Title VII, or Bilingual Education Act, was replaced by this one, which was Title III, called the Language Instruction for Limited English Proficient and Immigrant Student. Bilingual was removed, and now we have limited English proficient students. Bilingual education programs were neither encouraged nor restricted. Each state was required to make academic content standards and assessments to measure the standards, and their results were used to hold each school accountable. All students, including English language learners, were expected to pass the state test. Under Title III, each state was required to establish English language proficiency standards for all grade levels, and English language learners were tested on these standards once a year. No Child Left Behind drove education policy for 14 years, but because of the focus on high-stakes testing, many teachers would only teach the test, and bilingual education programs were unfortunately discouraged. The last act I will be talking about is the Every Student Succeeds Act from 2015. This is the Title I Act, and it is the progress in meeting academic standards and passing state assessments must be tracked into 4 different subgroups. One of these subgroups is being the English language learners. Having English language learners in their own subgroup will help schools and students be held accountable for their learning. Title I also requires states to have English language proficiency standards that cover listening, speaking, reading, and writing. English language learners in all grades must take the ELP assessment each year. This is a fairly new act, so there is not much data on how these policies have and will affect English language learning students. English language learning students should be getting the help they need because schools are being held accountable on these high-stakes standards for this subgroup. In conclusion, there have been many court cases and laws passed to implement and improve the education for ESL students and to make equal opportunities for all English language learning students, as seen in these 10 major events. And here is the final slide, which is my works cited.